Hello, S.C. Whitmore government students. Today's lesson is going to be on Article 1 of the Constitution. And Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the Congress, the legislative branch of government. Now, it is the Congress, it's their job to make the law. That's the most important thing that our Congress does. But Article 1 of the Constitution deals specifically with the authority and responsibilities of the Congress. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. The executive branch would be found in Article 2, the judicial branch in Article 3, and then there are other articles as well. But Article 1 deals with the Congress. Now, the Congress is made up of two different houses. Remember, we had a compromise at the Constitutional Convention over how many houses of Congress we were going to have. The large states wanted representation in the Congress to be based on population because the bigger states would have more power that way. The smaller states wanted it to be equal for all states. So the resulting compromise actually created a bicameral legislature, a bicameral Congress. All bicameral means is two houses. So they created one house, which would be based on population, where larger states would have more representatives. And then they created the other house, which would be equal for all states. The house that's based on population is called the House of Representatives. It has 435 members in the House, and it's based on population. So California has way more people in the House of Representatives than South Carolina does. Now, that number, the total number, 435, that actually is capped now. So we're not going to have more than 435 members of the House. But early on, that number was much smaller. And as the population of America grew, that number grew until we got to a point that we decided 435 was going to be the max. Now, what does happen is that as states grow faster than other states, they get more, we see these representatives shift around. In other words, South Carolina, when I was a kid, had 5 representatives. Well, we've actually grown faster than some other states have, so now we have 7. So over the course of my lifetime, we've gone from having 5 representatives to 7. Other states have not grown as fast, like states especially in the Midwest. Let's talk about Pennsylvania, for instance. Pennsylvania its population has grown slower than South Carolina's, so they actually have lost representatives. But what happens is we have 435 total, and as we take a census and find out how many people live in America and which state they live in, different states can lose or gain representatives. Right now in South Carolina, we have 7. These representatives are elected to 2-year terms. So they are elected, they serve 2 years, and then they have to run for re-election. So every other year, all 435 members of the House are elected or re-elected or unelected. They can elect someone else, and the person who was in power is gone. Because of that, the House of Representatives is considered closer to the people. What that means is, like, a senator represents an entire state. Like, we have 2 senators in South Carolina. They represent the entire state of South Carolina. My member of the House of Representatives only represents my district in South Carolina. And because there are 7, South Carolina is divided up into 7 districts, and my representative represents my district. If you live in another part of the state, then you have a different representative, and they just represent your district. So they represent a smaller group of people, so therefore they're considered closer to the people. In other words, if I need to contact someone in the Congress, I'm going to have a much easier opportunity to have my voice heard by my member of the House because that person represents a smaller group of people. It's considered the lower house because, generally speaking, the debate is quicker in the House of Representatives. They move much quicker. They don't debate things quite as long. They pass laws at a much quicker level. That is very different than the next house we're going to talk about, which is the Senate. So in the Senate, things move much slower. They debate things much longer. It's a smaller body. There are only 100 members of the Senate, 2 from each state. So because there are 50 states, there are now 100 members of the Senate. If we were to add a state, like Puerto Rico, let's say we added Puerto Rico as a state, then there would be 102 members of the Senate because Puerto Rico would add their 2 senators. The senators are elected to 6-year terms, so their terms are much longer than a term in the House of Representatives. But not every senator is up for re-election every 6 years. We stagger it. So a third of the Senate is elected this year, for instance, in 2022, a third of the Senate will be up for election. And then in 2024, the second third are up for re-election. And then in 2026, the last third are up for re-election. So it's staggered. But all told, a term for a senator is 6 years. It's considered the upper house because the debate is slower. They generally, it's thought that the Senate works better together than members of the House do. It's not as partisan. Now, that has changed over time. We've seen the Senate become even more partisan, and there have been more heated arguments in the Senate. But in general, it's considered more cordial, more friendly, slower paced. Things go much slower in the Senate. Now, so we've got the House of Representatives, we've got the Senate. Together, they make up our Congress. Now, what are the powers of Congress? Well, Congress has a lot of power. And all these powers are found in Article 1. For instance, in Article 1, Section 3, it makes it clear that Congress is the one who has the power to create a new state. So if we were to, for instance, add Puerto Rico as a state, it would be Congress who did that, not the president, not the court system. It would be the Congress. But most of the specific or enumerated or expressed powers, that's what we call specific powers given to Congress, expressed power, most of those are found in Article 1, Section 8. In fact, there are 17 of them listed in Article 1, Section 8. So you want to know what powers Congress has? Go to Article 1, Section 8, and it lists 17 of them. I'm not going to go over all of them, but just to give you some examples, it has the power to tax. It has the power to coin money. So our dollar was created by Congress. It has the power to raise an army. It has the power to declare war on other nations. And it has the power, the last thing it says there is to make laws that are necessary and proper for governing. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean, necessary and proper? Well, it means that just because it's not specifically listed doesn't mean that Congress can't do it. For instance, each of these expressed powers has implied powers within it. So, for instance, the power to tax, that's the expressed power of Congress. Well, the implied power within that is that Congress can create an agency to collect taxes. And they did. They created what was called the IRS, and that's its job, is to collect taxes. Well, nowhere does it say that Congress can create an agency to collect taxes, but it's implied. It's necessary and proper, if you're going to have the power to tax, that you have to have the power to collect taxes. The power to raise an army, that's the specific express power. But then Congress, the necessary and proper or implied power to raise an army is that they can create a draft. A draft is where you force people to join an army, and we've done that throughout our history in times of war. Now, we haven't had a draft in a long time, but we have had them. For instance, the Civil War, we had a draft. World War II. The Vietnam was the last one we had. Vietnam, people were drafted into the army. Nowhere does it say Congress can create a draft, and yet it's implied as part of the necessary and proper clause for governing. There's a lot, in other words, that Congress can do that aren't specifically expressed or enumerated in the Constitution. Now, there are things Congress cannot do. There are prohibited powers. And these prohibited powers were listed specifically to make sure that Congress did not get too powerful. The founders were worried about power being too great in the federal government. So they limited power to the president, they limited the power to the judicial branch, to the courts, but they also limited power to the Congress. So, like, for instance, one of the things Congress cannot do is they cannot pass ex post facto laws. Now, these are Latin terms, but ex post facto means they can't create a law to punish someone after the fact. In other words, they see people that are doing things they don't like, so they create a law and say, oh, you're going to be punished because you did that 2 weeks ago. Well, if it wasn't a law 2 weeks ago, then they can't be punished for it. They can't create a law that's retroactive. and punishes people for stuff they've done in the past. Those are called ex post facto laws. Congress can't do that. Congress cannot create what's called a bill of attainder, meaning they can't convict someone of a crime without a fair trial. People have to be able to go through the court system, in other words. Congress can't just declare, you know what, we don't think what you did was right, therefore you're guilty, and throw you in jail. There are some lawmaking bodies that were doing that and that have done that, but not our Congress. Our Congress cannot do that. Congress cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus. That means they can't deny you due process. Uh, so basically, what that means is they can't throw you in jail and not give you a fair trial, not charge you with the crime. Those things have to go through the court system, and you have to be given a proper defense. That's called due process. Congress cannot suspend that. That's called suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Now, the president has done that before. Abraham Lincoln did that during the Civil War. He threw people in jail who were writing bad things about the government during the Civil War. But because it was a time of crisis, he was able to throw those people in jail. Now, eventually, they had to be released. But presidential power is a little bit different than congressional power. Congress can't do that, though. Congress cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus. They cannot take away the due process that you have as an American citizen. I doubt a president could do that now either, though they might try. Okay. The most important thing, however, that Congress does is make laws. And so let's talk about the lawmaking process very quickly. And if you've ever seen the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill, it's a song that talks about how a bill becomes a law. Well, that's the lawmaking process. That's how Congress makes laws. I would encourage you to check that out. You can find it on YouTube, Schoolhouse Rock, How a Bill Becomes a Law. And that's a little cartoon image of a bill. But basically, a bill starts by getting drafted and introduced. So a member of Congress or members of Congress will draft or write a bill. They'll write a proposal for a law, and then it'll get introduced in the Congress. Now, all of these lawmaking powers are found in Article 1, Section 7. And this is the most important thing that happens. Article 1, Section 7 talks about the lawmaking process. So a bill is written, drafted, and introduced. Then the bill goes to a committee and then potentially a subcommittee. And in that committee, what happens is it gets marked up. The committee will debate it in a small way, and they will make changes to it to make it more, to give it more of the ability to get passed by the larger body. But once it gets marked up and changed and honed and they get it right where they want it, then the committee can refer that bill to the entire chamber, whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate, depending on which chamber we're talking about. But let's pretend it's the House of Representatives. So that bill would leave the committee and it would go to the entire House of Representatives, where they would then debate that bill. People would get to have their say of whether they think it's a good bill or a bad bill. They would get to make an argument over whether that bill should pass or not. And then at some point, the debate will end and the chamber, the House of Representatives in this case, will vote on the bill. If the vote is passed, if the bill is passed, then that bill goes to the other chamber. It would go to the Senate. And then the thing would work completely over again. Then it would go, the Senate would send it to committee, it would come out of committee, be debated in the Senate, and then if the Senate passes it, then what happens is the two chambers will have to work out any differences in the bill in what's called a conference committee. So the House of Representatives would appoint some of the members to the conference committee, the Senate will appoint some of the members to the conference committee, and in the conference committee, they'll work out the minor differences that each side has in the bill. Once those differences are worked out, then it will go for final approval in the House and the Senate. And if both approve it, then that bill goes to the president. At that point, the president can sign the bill into law. Then the bill becomes a law. Once the president signs it, it's a law. or the president can veto it and say, I don't approve of this bill. At that point, the vetoed bill goes back to Congress, and the House and the Senate can either override a president's veto or they don't override it and the bill dies. If they override it, it takes 2/3 vote. It's not just a majority, it takes 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to override a presidential veto. If they do that, then the bill becomes a law without the president having signed it. Now, every step of the way you can see it's much easier for a bill to die than it is to get passed. It can die in committee, it can die in subcommittee, it can die in the chamber. In other words, they can vote it down, it can be vetoed. It can die in conference committee. There are so many ways a bill can die, and most bills don't ever get passed. The thousands of bills that are proposed every year, most of them don't get passed. It's only a small percentage that actually make it through each of these steps and get signed by the president or overridden the president's veto. In other words, it's hard to make a law. It's a whole process, which is designed to be that way. The founders didn't want a Congress that can make a law easily because the founders, remember, wanted to limit power. And making a law hard to pass limits the power of the Congress. So Congress, in other words, Congress is only supposed to pass laws that the people really want and that are really good for the country. Now, we know that's not always the case, but that's how it's supposed to work. Okay, let's talk about checks and balances with the Congress. So the Congress is part of the legislative branch. Then we have the judicial branch, which is the court system. Then we have the executive branch, which is the led by the president. Each of these branches has certain checks over the other branches, and in the end, those powers are supposed to balance out, where no one branch is more powerful than the other branch. So what are some of the specific powers or checks that the Congress has over the other branches? Well, here's some examples. Congress can override a presidential veto. That's a check on the president. The president can veto a law, but the Congress can override the president. The Senate has to approve all presidential appointments. So the president can appoint members to his cabinet. The president appoints members to the courts. The judicial branch, the president appoints those people, but the Senate has to approve those appointments. And if they don't approve those appointments, then the president has to go find another person to take that place. Congress has what we call the power of the purse. In other words, they fund everything. So let's say the president sends troops to an area of the world and he wants to fight a war. Congress doesn't have to declare war, but Congress also doesn't have to fund those troops. They can say, no, we're not going to actually fund the troops. So you can send them all you want to, but we're not actually going to pay for it. And if they don't pay for it, then the president would have no choice but to send troops back. That never happens, but in theory, it could happen. Congress can actually impeach and remove from office presidents and federal judges. That's a huge check on the other branches. They can actually remove those people. They can remove a judge from the judicial branch. They can remove a president from the executive branch if they believe and can prove that that judge or that president has committed a high crime or misdemeanor. We've actually had 4 presidents impeached in our history. Actually 4 impeachments. President Trump was impeached twice. So Andrew Johnson was impeached in the 1860s. Richard Nixon wasn't impeached, he resigned, but Andrew Johnson was impeached. Bill Clinton was impeached in the 1990s, and Donald Trump was impeached twice. None of those presidents were removed from office, however. So Congress has never impeached and removed a president, but they could. They have impeached and removed judges before. So that is an important power that Congress has. And then the last check that the Congress has is a Congress can pass a constitutional amendment. So let's say that they pass a law. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court, says that law violates the Constitution. Well, the way Congress can get around that is pass a constitutional amendment. Now, that is not an easy thing to do. It's actually a very hard process to do, which is why we only have ever had 27 of them. There are only 27 amendments to the Constitution, but Congress can do that. That's a check that they have. So What I hope you've seen today in this lesson is that Congress has a number of powers and a number of things that they can't do as well. It is a very important part of our government. The founders intended it to be the most powerful part of our government. I don't know that it is today, but that was the intent. But I hope that you go back and you can actually read Article 1 of the Constitution and see what different powers the Congress has and what different things the Congress cannot do. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can make an appointment to meet with me, and we can talk more about the powers of the Congress. Until next time, have a great day.